There is a ledger in the National Archives that most researchers never request. It is bound in dark cloth. Its spine is cracked from age and from the pressure of what it contains. Inside it, running in careful columns across page after page, are numbers. Not names. Numbers. Each number corresponds to a child. A real child who entered an American institutional system sometime in the 1880s and was assigned a number at the moment of intake that the system would use to track them for as long as they remained within its reach. Their name appears in a separate column beside the number. But the name is secondary. The number is the identifier. The number is what appears in the transfer records when they were moved from one institution to another. The number is what appears in the placement records when they were sent to a family somewhere in the Midwest or the Plains states. The number is what appears in the discharge records when they left the system by whatever means the system used to discharge children who had passed through it. The number persisted across every institutional transaction. The name changed, sometimes more than once. And the ledger that assigned the original number is one of the few documents anywhere that preserves the connection between the number the institution knew and the name the child had carried before the institution gave them a new one. I found this while researching the institutional systems that processed children during the peak years of the orphan train era. Trying to understand how institutions that were simultaneously claiming to rescue children could have lost track of so many of them so completely. The answer kept pointing to the same structural feature of how these institutions operated, not the intentions of the people who ran them, not the resources available to them, not even the volume of children they were processing. The information architecture, the way records were designed, what those records were designed to capture, and more importantly, what they were designed to allow to disappear. The official story of American child welfare institutions in the late 19th century is a story of emerging social conscience producing institutional responses to genuine problems. Before the 1850s, there was no systematic institutional response to the problem of homeless or parentless children in American cities. Children without family support ended up wherever the city's other unwanted populations ended up. In almshouses alongside elderly paupers and mentally ill adults. In jails alongside petty criminals and serious offenders. On streets that offered them nothing except the dangers that streets in 19th century American cities contained. The reformers who established the first dedicated children's institutions in the 1850s and 1860s genuinely believed they were creating something better than what existed. Specialized environments for children. With educational programs. With structured routines. With the supervised developmental environment that the reform theory of the period held was necessary to transform children who had been exposed to the corrupting influences of street life into productive members of society. That belief was sincere. And in some cases, the institutions that grew from it provided genuine care and genuine opportunity to children who had none. The historical record contains real stories of children who passed through these institutions and emerged with educations and skills and opportunities they would not otherwise have had. Those stories are real. That story is not wrong. What it does not address is the information systems those institutions built. And what those information systems were actually designed to accomplish. Here is what the intake records from the major child welfare institutions of the 1870s and 1880s reveal when you examine them systematically rather than through the lens of individual cases. The institutions that processed the largest volumes of children developed intake systems that prioritized operational efficiency over biographical completeness. A child entering the New York Juvenile Asylum in the 1870s received an intake number before they received anything else, before their name was verified against any prior record, before their family background was documented beyond whatever the intake clerk could record in the minutes available, before any attempt was made to establish whether they had living relatives who might be searching for them, before any effort was made to determine whether their presence on the street that had brought them to the institution's attention was a permanent condition or a temporary crisis that a functioning family system might resolve if anyone thought to look for it. The number came first, because the number was what the institution needed to manage its population. The biographical information that would have connected that number to a specific family, a specific origin, a specific history that existed before the institution, that information was collected inconsistently at best, and in many cases not collected at all. Not because the intake clerks were callous, because the system they were operating had been designed for throughput, for processing children from intake to placement as efficiently as the logistics of the orphan train system required. And thorough biographical documentation was not efficient. It was slow. It required follow-up. It required contact with families or communities or authorities who might complicate the placement process by asserting claims on the child the institution was processing. A number was efficient. A number moved. A name connected to a fully documented biography was complicated. A number was not. Now here is where it gets strange. The numbering systems were not uniform across institutions. Each major institution developed its own system, its own numbering sequence, its own record format, its own criteria for what biographical information was worth the time required to capture it. And these systems did not communicate with each other. A child who passed through multiple institutions accumulated multiple numbers in multiple systems with no master record anywhere connecting those numbers to each other or to the child who had carried them through each system in sequence. The New York Foundling Hospital used one numbering system. The Children's Aid Society used another. The New York Juvenile Asylum used a third. Catholic protectories had their own systems. Protestant placing out agencies had theirs. When a child was transferred from one institution to another, which happened regularly and is documented in the transfer records that survive the receiving institution, assigned a new number. The connection between the old number and the new number existed only in the transfer paperwork, and the transfer paperwork was completed under the same time pressure that governed every other administrative function in these institutions, which means it was sometimes complete and sometimes not, which means a child who entered the New York Foundling Hospital as number 4,847 and was transferred to the Children's Aid Society where they became number 12,093, and was then placed on an orphan train to Kansas where they were listed in the placement records under a name that the placing agent had assigned because the child's original name was difficult to spell or difficult to, remember, might appear in 3 separate institutional archives as 3 apparently separate individuals, with no document anywhere in the surviving record connecting those 3 numbers to the same child, and no institutional authority anywhere that had ever been responsible for making that connection. The descendants of orphan train riders who search the institutional archives today encounter exactly this problem. They find a number. They find a name beside the number. They cannot find any document connecting that name to the family the child came from, because the institutional record system was not designed to preserve that connection. It was designed to manage a population, to move children from intake to placement as efficiently as possible, to document each step of that movement in terms of the institution's own administrative needs, not in terms of the biographical continuity of the children being moved. The numbering is not incidental to this history. It is the mechanism through which the institutional processing of children systematically replaced individual identity with institutional identity. A child who entered the system with a name, a family, a neighborhood, an origin, a history that existed before the institution left the system with a number and whatever the intake clerk had managed to write down in the minutes available before the next child arrived at the door. The name in the ledger might be accurate. It might be a phonetic approximation of a name the clerk had heard but not recognized. It might be a name the child had given because they did not speak English and the intake clerk did not speak whatever language the child did. It might be a name someone else had given the child because no one had thought to ask the child what their name actually was, and the number beside it is the only thing the system reliably preserved. The number is what the system knew. The name is what the system wrote down. The family is what the system discarded. Maybe the numbering systems were simply the practical response to an overwhelming administrative problem. Maybe the institutions that developed them were doing the best they could with the resources and the knowledge and the administrative theory available to them in the 1870s and 1880s. Maybe the loss of biographical continuity was an unfortunate byproduct of systems designed to provide care rather than a structural feature designed to prevent family reunification. These are legitimate arguments. They deserve to be taken seriously. I took them seriously for a long time before I looked at the specific design choices embedded in the intake records. The choice to assign a number before verifying a name. The choice to design intake forms with minimal space for family background information. The choice to build placement systems that used institutional numbers rather than biographical identifiers to track children across transfers. The choice to maintain separate numbering systems in institutions that regularly transferred children between each other without building any cross-reference mechanism. Each of these was a choice made by people who understood institutional administration, who knew that the alternative to each choice existed, who selected the option that made the system run faster over the option that would have preserved the connection between the child and the family the child came from. The ledgers are still in the archives. The numbers are still in the ledgers. The names are still beside the numbers. And the connection between those names and the families they came from is still absent from the record. Not because the records were destroyed. Not because the archives were sealed. Because the system that created the records was designed from the beginning to let that connection disappear. The descendants of orphan train riders have been searching those archives for decades. They find the numbers. They find the names. They hit the wall where the family should be. And the wall is not the result of archival loss. It is the result of archival design. The records still exist. The gap in the records still exists too, designed into the system that created them. By people who understood exactly what they were designing.